Hi everybody. Well, my name is Robin and this little chap, this is Buster, and I know a lot of you people who are watching will have been on my tours in the past, and so you'll know who Buster is. In fact, some of you have walked him. And I've been a tour guide for what, now 18 years. Before that I was teaching, and when I do these tours I don't really have a script as such. I just have a wealth of stories, and out they come, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Now what the stories are today is basically about debauchery, which is sex and drugs and drunkenness, and where else but the South Bank to go. Now this isn't modern day, because otherwise I'd be walking around King's Cross and parts of Shepherd's Market. But no, this is about the times from the 1300s through to the 1700s, encompassing people like Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, and one of my favourite painters ever, William Hogarth. This street where we're starting from is probably the least debauched place that I can think of. This is called Fish Street Hill. Fish Street Hill. It used to have a market, and just round the corner down here, this is Billingsgate Fish Market. That's how it used to be. And Fish Street Hill, this is where the good Catholics would come on a Friday to pick up their fish. And then we stopped being a Catholic country. We became a Protestant country. And London became the most Protestant place in the entire country. The street just up here is called Gracechurch Street, but Fish Street Hill comes to an end. It turns into Gracechurch Street, then it becomes Bishopsgate, and it leads right through to the north of London. We went through here. This is the major north-south route through the city. That's why this street had such importance. Straight over London Bridge, the only bridge across the River Thames, anywhere for about 20 miles. If you go out of the city to the north, you come to an area called Spitalfields. And that was one of the areas where, well, the ne'er-do-wells, the lazy, the incompetent, they would go and have fun and get drunk. This is Hayes Wharf, or Hayes Galleria as it is today, a shopping centre. But what it used to be was a tea dock. This is where the tea would be brought in after having come all the way around the world. It was designed to be large and open because you had ships the size of a Cuddy Sark, literally the size of a Cuddy Sark, coming in here and unloading. And tea was one of the most important things in the British Empire. Manufactures would be made in Manchester. They'd be brought down the ship canals to Liverpool and sailed down through the Atlantic Ocean around the Horn of Africa and over to India. And in India, they would sell all of the manufacturers because the Indian people, they weren't allowed to make anything of their own because it's great having an empire. And once the Indian people had bought all of our goods and we had loads of money, we then bought India's one big cash crop, opium. And we bought lots of opium and we sailed it all the way round to China, and then we sold it to the Chinese. Now, after a few years, the Chinese suddenly realised that their people were becoming addicted to opium, and they decided to ban the opium trade from England. And so we behaved like any good drug dealer. We sent gunboats all the way round to China. We sailed them up the Yangtze River and the Yellow River. We blew up Chinese town after town until the Chinese said, okay, we'll take your opium. And that is how we sold the opium to China. And China was the only country in the world that made tea. And so we would buy the tea with the money we'd made from the opium trade and then sail it back here. Tea was an integral part of the drug trade in the 1800s. Okay, well, just behind us here is Thule Street. And what used to be here, well, it was nothing like this. All the area where I'm standing now, this was making beer, it was breweries, all the way down. From pretty much London Bridge, halfway down to the Tower Bridge, was breweries. I have old maps of this area, and they mark individually the buildings that were here. And on one of the maps, there were only 3 buildings that were not breweries. One of them was a Catholic boys' school. The other 2 was a gin bottling factory, and the other one was a distillery for making gin. Now, beer making. Why was it so important? Well, water was poisonous. If you drank water, it killed you. You died of cholera, or you died of typhus, or you died of dysentery. Water was poisonous, so the only thing that you could drink was beer, and this is where they made it. The first book ever written in the English language was a book called The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, and in that book they mentioned making beer, and they mentioned making beer here. They drank Southwark ale, and this is where we are, Southwark. So that book was written back in about 1370, so that's how far the brewing goes back here. Before that, now, when they made beer, after the malted barley was brewed up, and then you'd add in the yeast, and then slowly it would turn into alcohol, and the first brewing of beer would produce a beer of around about 12% alcohol. Now 12% alcohol, this is like drinking table wine. If you drank that from the moment you woke up to the moment you fell asleep, you'd be out of your crust by midday. No, you couldn't drink that. That was for evenings. In the evenings, they'd take out the good stuff to drink. So what they did was they brewed the malted barley for a second time. But this time there's a lot less sugar in the malted barley, and so it made a much, much weaker beer. A beer of only about 4 to 5%. That's like drinking Kronenberg all day long. That's what people drank in those days. They started out at about 6 in the morning when they first woke up, beer for breakfast, and they would carry on drinking it until tea time, when they went on to the hard stuff. What about poor little children? Because you can't give little children cholera and typhoid or dysentery, so no. For little children, they brewed the beer for a 3rd time, and this time they got a very weak beer of only 2%, and that was called small beer. And it was small beer for small people. And so really what you have to imagine is that here in London, from the moment you were taken off the breast, you were drunk for the rest of your life. The other side of Thule Street was a completely different trade. That was leather tanneries. Now tanneries were important. It was one of the most important trades in London. what you drank out of. You didn't drink out of a pewter tanker. Most people couldn't afford one of those. And a leather tanker, that's what you drank from. Your saddles for your horses were made out of leather. Your boots you were wearing. Your buckles for your sword. Everything was made out of leather. And so, creating leather was a really important trait. The Tanners Guild was very powerful indeed. And when they made the leather, the process is worth telling you about. They would get the tan wool, they'd get the hides from the other side of the river, they'd bring them down here, mostly little boys, pulling them along in hand carts. Once they'd get them here, they'd begin the tanning process. They would have a big wooden bath laid out, the hides would be put in, then they would pour on a substance called quicklime. Quicklime is a very strong alkaline, and it burns into it. Now when you think of a piece of hide, it's got hair all over one side, because cows are hairy beasts. On the other side, it's full up with gobbets of gore. So you want to eat this stuff off. And that's what the quicklime does, it eats it away. After a day or two of laying in the bath, then you take out the piece of tan hide, and now you've got to get rid of all that horrible stuff off of it. So you give it to the little children, because they're very cheap labour. They take it down to the river. The little children would then wash the leather in the River Thames. They would use a comb, it's called a currying comb. They would take off all the hair, scrape off all the gobbets of gore, and now you've got a tan hide. The only problem is, it's slowly disintegrating, because the quicklime has got into the leather itself, and it's still starting to eat it away. If you leave it, it's going to go hard and dry, and it's going to crack, and it's useless. So now you need to soften the leather to counteract the quicklime. So that's done in a separate bath. This bath has a substance called tanner's stuff. Tanner's stuff was a mixture of feces and urine. You mix them together into a nice brown sludge, and you put your hide in, poured on your tanner's stuff, put another hide in, poured on some more stuff, and you build it up very slowly, so that it's like a sort of grotesque lasagna. You leave it there for 2 or 3 days as it starts to neutralise, and then you take out the hides, and well, they're pretty smelly, so you need to give them a clean, so you give them to the little boys again. The boys would take them down to the river, and they would wash them in the river. And the problem is that on a really cold day, say a February day, these kids, they're washing it in the river, it's freezing cold, and slowly they would start to die by the riverbank. Little blue children would just be falling over. And one day, the Lord Mayor of London, crossing over London Bridge, he looked out of his carriage and he could see the little boys laying there dead. And he was outraged by this. He was a decent man, a good man. In fact, in some ways, a modern man. And he went to the Guild of Tanners and he said to them, "You mustn't do this, you're killing children." And they told him to mind his own business, quite literally mind his own business. He was a member of the Guild of Mercers. They said, "Don't tell us what to do, this is our trade." He was so incensed, he was so annoyed by their behaviour that he went to Parliament. It took 7 years of arguing, but he finally got a law passed. The law states that small children should not clean leather on very cold days. Now that is a tiny baby step, but we believe that that is the very first piece of child legislation in this country. It's possibly the first piece of child legislation anywhere in the world. The man, the Lord Mayor who did this, was a man called Richard Whittington, 3 times elected Lord Mayor of London and appointed for a 4th term. One of my favourite characters, and I'll be telling you more about him later. Oh yes, and just to point out, the Lord Mayor who was crossing over in his carriage, and this was way back in the 1390s, was a Lord Mayor called Richard Whittington, or Dick Whittington, as we know him today. Now, For all the British people who are watching this video, you know who Dick Whittington was. He had a cat. And every British person knows the story of Dick Whittington. He comes to London as a poor boy, and he has been told that the streets of London are paved with gold. And all you have to do is bend down and pick it up, and you're a rich man. But when he came to London, he found that we had no sewage system in this town, and what the streets were paved with was something entirely different. So he turns away, and as he goes out of London, he thinks, I'm going back to the country where I came from. And then he could hear the bells, and the bells were saying to him, they were talking to him. They said, turn again, Dick Whittington, turn again. 3 times Lord Mayor of London. And so he came back to London with his little cat, and he gets a job working on a ship, and he goes to Morocco, and in Morocco they have lots and lots of rats. But his cat is the best at killing rats anywhere in the world, and it kills all the rats in Morocco, including the king rat. And Dick Whittington is given a fortune by the King of Morocco, and he comes back and is made Lord Mayor of London. And that is the story that every child knows, and it's absolute rubbish. None of that actually happened at all. In reality, Richard Whittington was a rich merchant who became Lord Mayor of London, but he did charitable things. And the one thing which I've got to say that I like him for more than anything is he gave us our first public toilets. Thank you very much. This here is the church of St Michael Paternoster Royal. It was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London, as most of them were. Unfortunately, all the people who were buried in there, well, their graves just got lost in the fire. So we're not quite sure where some of them are. But if we're just going to go around the corner now. So this is where our hero, Richard Whittington, is buried in here. See the date, 1422. 4 times Lord Mayor of London, 3 times elected, 1 time he was appointed, and without any doubt, one of our greatest Lord Mayors. When the Romans first arrived here, well, they needed a bridge across the River Thames. This was a pretty easy place to build a bridge. It was shallow, easy to get to. And that there, that yellow building, that's the old Bishopsgate. That's the Billingsgate Fish Market. And the Billingsgate Fish Market, if you go underneath, you see where it's all held up on supports. If you go underneath, the archaeologists have been having a bit of a dig around there, and they found some of the original Roman piers which held up the original bridge, and that's where it used to be. Then, come the medieval period, back in the 1200s, London Bridge moved a bit further downriver, and if you see the gap between the glass buildings and the white building next to it, that gap, that's where London Bridge used to be, right there. That's the one where we saw it from the other side, and when we were looking down Fish Street Hill, that's where the old London Bridge was, the one that had the houses on. In case you're wondering why I've just shown you a picture of a pub with a train and a railway arch, well, I don't know if you've ever read a book or seen a film called Bridget Jones, but that's where she lives. Well, this is the George. It's the only galleried coaching inn left surviving in the whole of London. But London used to be full of these places. You'd ride in here with your carriage, with enough space here to turn the carriage round. The horses would be dealt with, and then you go for a drink, maybe even stay the night here at the George. Oh, and hello, there's a dog looking out there. And This is where William Shakespeare went before a show to give himself a bit of good luck, because this pub is called the George, and William Shakespeare was born on St George's Day, and he thought it was a lucky place to go. In 1670 it burned down and they rebuilt it, and it was here, in this courtyard, that Charles Dickens would come, and he would stand here and he would read out all of the scripts for his new books. He would gauge the response of all the people who were here, and if he got the right answer, he got a laugh in the right place, he got an ooh in the right place, he would keep it in. So Shakespeare and Dickens have stood right here, and one of the most historic pubs in London, the George, just off the Borough High Street, and well worth coming, but not if you've got a dog. They don't like dogs in here. So, Southern Tavern. My wife and myself, we used to go there quite often to a quiz night on a Tuesday. We weren't the best team. The best team were a team called Fat Kids Are Harder to Kidnap, and it was very tough to beat. But when we used to have the quiz, it was downstairs. There's a downstairs bar, and all the way around it are like little tiny rooms with arched ceilings, and you can go and sit in those and cheat by using your mobile phone. But what they were the cells of a prison. Where we are now was a prison, and the prison was called the Counter. And right by my feet, well, it's still marked out. This is where the Counter prison was, underneath the road, and the prison cells still there to this day. Part of the pub now. There were 5 prisons in this area. Just down the road here, that was the Marshalsea. That's where Dickens' family were put in prison for debt. Charles Dickens was the only one who wasn't in prison. He was working, putting boot polish in cans with his friend Fagin. And a little further down the street, you go down, you come to an area called King's Bench. King's Bench. Well, that was a prison mostly for debtors. And it's where I go and vote nowadays. Just back behind these buildings, this huge, large building here, it's a grey building. If you go back a way, you'll come to the Clink. The Clink prison. Well, we'll go down there and have a look at that a bit later, but it was one of the nastiest prisons in London. So prisons just about everywhere you went, and of course the Counter. Now, the big grey building we've been looking at, we're going to go and have a quick look at it a bit closer, because this was one of the most important buildings in the whole of London. But just here, just beside the Southwark Tavern, is a very large building indeed. This is called the Hop Exchange, and it's bigger than the stock market used to be, the stock exchange, because hops were just that much more important. And just in case you're not quite sure what you use hops for, when you crack the malted barley and you brew it up with a water and boil it, you create a very sugary mixture indeed. Put the yeast in, it turns into alcohol, but a great deal of the excess sugar is still left in the beer. If you don't put hops in, it tastes vile. It's sticky and cloying and really not refreshing at all. Put the hops in, nice, clean, bitter taste to it. That's what the hops are for. So if you want to make beer, you need hops. And the hops were bought the road down here to my right. This here is called the Borough High Street. And that leads down to the Old Kent Road. And it's over in Kent. That's where all the hop fields were. And my parents My mother, my father, my grandparents would go down to the hop fields, and that for us Londoners was a holiday, picking hops. So this is the Crossbone Cemetery. This is where people who didn't deserve a good Christian burial is where they were put. Unconsecrated ground. And when Charles Dickens came to write a book called Little Dorrit, this features heavily in that. It was a book about poor people. Prostitutes tend to be poor people. The very first history of London, a man called John Stone, they mention the Crossbone Cemetery in it. So this place has been around for a long, long time. In the Victorian period, it was decided that awful bodies that were buried in here full of all sorts of nasty diseases, that the diseases could come out and that they could spread to the surrounding populace. And so it was decided in Parliament to cover this with 3 feet deep of concrete, with 3 feet of quicklime put on top to rot the bodies down. And well, the concrete is still here. Rail track, they tried to build an office block on here, but unfortunately they found, due to local opposition and the fact that there's still a law in Parliament not to build on the site of this place, well, it's become a monument, and it's become somewhere that people who have lost loved ones, they can put up a little ribbon for them. It's a monument for people who don't normally get a monument, and there's only a couple of those in the whole of London. This is one. Hi. Maiden Lane. On the old maps that I have, Maiden Lane stretches all the way back eastward up to London Bridge and off of the Borough High Street. And when you'd come over the London Bridge from the city, desperate to get away from those damn Puritans who were banning everything, any kind of fun, they were banning it. You weren't allowed to go to the theatre. No, there's no theatres over in the city of London. Prostitutes, well, they'd kicked all of the prostitutes out. If you wanted to come and see a prostitute, well, you came down here. And if you were coming over to see the theatre, you'd come over London Bridge, you'd walk down the Borough High Street, which has the George pub. There were over 120 pubs all the way down the street. And you'd get yourself well and truly drunk, and then you'd go to the theatre. You walk down Maid Lane, as it was called then, Maid Lane, Maiden Lane. You walk down, just down there, to my right. That was where the Globe Theatre used to be. Today it's a council estate. But I'm going to take you around to the site of the Globe in a few moments. But it's been a lot of other things in its time. So this is the Anchor Brewery, the site of the Anchor Brewery. It's all gone now, I'm afraid. But a list of the people who owned the brewery, mongers, mongers just sell things, Thrales, both Ralph and Henry, they're not very interesting, but their wife, Hester, now she's interesting. Hester Frail, she inherited the brewery from her husband, but she didn't want the fag of running the brewery. She was an elderly woman, she was in her 70s. She didn't want to be running a brewery, and so she decided to get the most intelligent man in the entire of London, possibly the most intelligent man in the world, Dr. Samuel Johnson, the man who wrote the first dictionary of the English language. She got him to be her manager. People began to talk at that time. They said, just think of the brilliance of Dr. Johnson with his brilliant mind, and Hester Frail loaded with money. What a great match they would make. Now sure, Dr. Johnson was in his late 30s and she was in her 70s, but what a good match they would have made. People thought to themselves, well, they're going to get married eventually. But unfortunately, Hester Thrale went on the grand tour of Europe. And as she went down through Italy, saw the wonders of Italy, she came back and she had married an 18-year-old Italian gigolo, which just goes to prove that she knew how to spend her money very well indeed. So this is Porter Street still. Porter Street, named not after a person, but after a type of beer, porter, a sort of very dark beer, a bit like Guinness really. And the man who ran the brewery, Dr. Samuel Johnson, there he is. And this image, when you bought your can of Berkeley Sparkling Blue, that was on the back of the can. So here we are. This is where the Globe Theatre really used to be. Now, over the years, the Thames has been embanked and made smaller and smaller. And we are now a lot further from the river than it was in those days. But if you look at the map here, this, believe it or not, is not a picture. This is what passed as a map in those days. And you can see the globe very carefully there. And if you look at it closely, apart from a few houses, it is right beside the River Thames. So this is the side of the globe. So the other side of the street was the River Thames. Running where the road is now was a row of little buildings. So that's what it looked like in Shakespeare's time. Completely different than it is today. Now, the theatre had been banned in the city of London. All of those good industrious Protestants, they wouldn't allow such time-wasting affairs as the theatre in the city. So you had to go outside, you had to go to Shoreditch and Spitalfields, or down here to the South Bank. Now Shakespeare's theatre, and that's what it was called, the theatre, was up in Spitalfields. And the problem is, the land that it was on was owned by a greedy, avaricious landlord. who kept bumping the rent on them. So one day when the landlord went off to the country to collect some rents, Shakespeare and his crew dismantled the theatre, took it into little pieces, and then carted it on carts down from Spitalfields over London Bridge and rebuilt it here. So it was renamed the Globe, but it was the original theatre. And the theatre was the first purpose-built theatre in the world. Before that, they used any open space they could as a theatre, but this was purpose-built. It had everything that needed. You could have special effects, and special places for the audience to be so they could get a great view. So the Globe was the start of modern theatre as we would know it. Now, when people came down across the river, they were released from the bounds of everyday life, and they could get themselves drunk, and they would on the Borough High Street. But as they came out of the pubs, they knew that they were coming down to the Globe, and it's a dry old place. And so you want to bring some refreshment with you. So what they would do is they would buy a small barrel of beer. It's called a pin. Now this small barrel, one strong man could put it up on his shoulder and carry it, and they would bring it down Maid Lane, down to the Globe Theatre, and then they would go in and they'd all become what they call groundlings, standing in the courtyard. But here's the thing. You'd have the barrel up on his shoulder, a little peg would be put into the barrel with a tap on it. Then you'd take out your leather tankards, put it underneath the barrel. You'd fill up your leather tankards, hand them round to all your friends. And then the barrel, turn off the tap, put the barrel on the ground, and now you've got something to sit on during the show. So these groundlings, unlike us today who stand there for 3 hours watching Hamlet, those guys had a seat and they would share it amongst their friends. Now, as you can imagine, everybody's drunk. Now the Puritans from time to time got really restrictive. At times they even banned women from going to see the show. Women were banned from being actors. They weren't allowed to be performing. And so the parts of women were played by boys, preferably boys who didn't need to shave. And so when you take a play like Romeo and Juliet, one of my favourites, Romeo and Juliet, it mentions in the play that Juliet was not beyond her 14th year, which means she was 14 years old. And Romeo, well, it doesn't mention Romeo's age. There's a good reason for that. Because the play is called Romeo and Juliet, and the best actors in the company wanted the title role. And the title role is Romeo, so the best actor, somebody like Burbage or Kemp, they got the role. The problem is, they were in their 50s, and they were playing opposite a 13-year-old boy, and he was their love interest. So somehow, Shakespearean audiences could somehow put aside this, almost sort of step out of reality, and sees these as the two star-crossed lovers. Now, when women were banned from attending the theatre, women persevered by pretending to be men. And they would put on manly stockings, and a big huge codpiece, and a big moustache, and a manly wig, and they would turn up in manly clothes with their doublet and hose, and they would attend the show. Now everybody in the place knew that they were women. Nobody was fooled by it. The actors would be looking at it, look, there's more women in there tonight than there are men. So Shakespeare began to write lines into his plays. And there are lots of lines in Shakespeare's plays about women dressed as men. And that is the reason. They're making fun with the audience, and it's a bit of interactive audience participation. Now take a show like Macbeth. Well, Macbeth, the opening words of Macbeth have nothing to do with fire burning and cauldron bubbling. It's not the Three Witches. The opening words when you read Macbeth, and I worked for a while in a theatre, so in set design, so I know this. The opening words are a blasted heath, thunder and lightning. And what they are is an instruction to the set dresser and to the special effects man as to how they want the show to start. And so how would they create a blasted heath? Well, it was created by having the stage stuck out. They would put blocks of wood with a hole in it with branches of trees, and you'd think, well, that looks pretty mean. But then they would have pots of what they called rare earth. And in this rare earth was basically bad gunpowder. And if you put a match to it, instead of exploding, it burned, created a smoke that came out. It hugged the stage, much like we would use dry ice. It would flow across the stage. So now, this is starting to look a lot better. Trees rising out of the mist. There are trap doors in the stage, and so the witches would rise up through a trap door, and there they would appear. This is starting to look, well, it's starting to look like modern theatre. And then you've got the instruction, thunder and lightning. Thunder was created by getting two wooden planks and putting them in a V shape, and rolling the cannonball all the way down. And the rumbling of a cannonball, a big iron cannonball, would make the sound of thunder. Lightning, above the stage, was a room which was built above the stage, with columns, and in the floor of the room were holes, and they would fire fireworks down onto the stage. You would have lightning blasts, thunder, and smoke across the stage. It's starting to look pretty much like a modern theatre production. And the special effects didn't stop there. Sword fighting, lay on Macduff and Danby him. That, well, Macbeth gets killed, and everybody wants to see him get killed. So when they stab him with their sword, blood spurts out everywhere. And that is because underneath his doublet, he has a bladder, and inside that is pig's blood. And there is blood everywhere. I mean, this is a modern production in every way. But once you've been to the theatre and you've had a lot of excitement, you've had maybe a bit of love interest, a bit of sword fighting, everything's been great, you come out, what do you want next? Well, you want women. Of course you do, it would make a nice rounded end to the night. And of course, these buildings that you see on this little map, this sign, those buildings were all brothels. All the way down, right next to the Thames, was a row of brothels, and they were called the stews. Stew is a corruption of an old French word. It means a cooking stove, because the brothels inside them had a cooking stove. And what they used to use it for was making water, hot water, so that the girls could take a wash. And they reckoned that the girls took a wash once a week. Once a week. And that kept them nice and clean. And if you think to yourself, well, once a week doesn't sound enough, you've got to think of the words of our Queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth I. She said, I take a bath once a year, whether I need it or not. So the prostitutes were clean. The problem was, after a while, fashions changed. Oliver Cromwell came along. There were no more theatres here. He banned the theatres throughout. It was only when Oliver Cromwell died and we had the reintroduction of our king, King Charles II, or the Restoration, theatres began to blossom again. But they didn't blossom here. They blossomed over by Covent Garden. The Theatre Royal Drury Lane was the first of the big rebuild theatres. And so this area began to fall apart. But one of the brothels down here, well, it decided to make a good go at surviving. The woman who owned the brothel, she printed up posters and handed out flyers down at the docks. What they said on the posters was that if a sailor was to bring his old spare trousers, worn out trousers, and bring them and give them to her. She would give him a girl for free. And most of the sailors on the ships, they knew that there was a box on the ship where all the old clothes were thrown. So they would root through the box, find an old pair of trousers, and they would bring them down. The sailors wore blue and white check trousers. They would bring them down, hand them the trousers, and they would get their girl for free. And after they'd had a girl, they'd had a few drinks, and then they'd think, you know, I've been at sea for 6 months, and I think another girl is exactly what I need. And so they would have a second girl, and they'd have a few more drinks. And after 3 days of whoring and drinking, they would happily wander out with no money left. They'd spent everything and had lost even their spare pair of trousers. But it's what she did with the trousers that I find interesting. The old spare trousers, she got the girls to clean them in the cooking stoves and then press them and then cut them up into little squares. And the blue and white squares were then sewn together to make pretty dresses for her girls, to dress them so they looked like fresh country milkmaids. And for a sailor, if you've been at sea for 6 months, a fresh country milkmaid is exactly what you want. And they would walk through this area with their little blue and white check dresses on, and all the girls, as they went along the road, all the girls would be chattering away, and the passers-by would look at them and say, look, there goes Mrs. Gingham's girls. And that is where Gingham material gets its name from. What we now dress little schoolgirls in was once the wear of prostitutes. So this is the rebuilt Globe Theatre, and well, it's not so far off. We have some idea of how big the real thing was, but when they took it apart over in Spitalfields and moved it down here, well, they kept records. So to some degree we can be pretty accurate about the dimensions of it. We know it was made out of wood. We know from some of the drawings which were made at the time of what it looked like and some of the maps. So yeah, it's about as close as we're going to get to what the Globe Theatre would have looked like. On the side of my boots is one of the pictures in a series of paintings called The Rake's Progress by William Hogarth. Hogarth's just about my favourite painter. What this shows is a place called the Rose Tea Room and the Rose Cafe restaurant. The Rose was a place of prostitution, and if you think Thailand is wild nowadays, you should have tried the Rose back then. Well, St Paul's Cathedral, that is London's great cathedral. It's Christopher Wren's masterpiece, really. Until they built, well, when I was a child we called it the Post Office Tower, now I think it's the Telecom Tower, changes its name. Until they built that, that was the tallest building pretty much in the whole of London. And beside it there's another little church you can see here, which is, you can just about pick it out with a grey spire. The weather vane on the top is a ship, and that is St Nicholas and Nicholas Cole Abbey. And St Nicholas was the patron saint of sailors and prostitutes, so two pretty much allied trades. And as we move along the river, we come to St Mary le Bow. And if you're born within the sound of Bow Bells, you're a Cockney. That's the Cockney Church right over there. Cockneys are not EastEnders at all. And then we move along a little bit further. We come to St James Garlic Hive on the horizon, and the big building with the columns and the big portico there, that is the Vintners Hall. That's the wine cellars. It is a huge building taking up an entire city block. The value of it is, well, I would have no idea how much that is worth. But it just shows you how much money is made from selling wine in London. Well, here we are at the end of the tour. We've stopped outside this place, which is called the Christchurch Watch House. Now, you might wonder why I've stopped at this point. Well, right here beside us, that is the Rosen Crown Pub, which I have drunk in for many, many years. I've had far too many good nights. The Watch House, this is where the vicar lives today, but what it was built for in those days was so that when they buried the bodies in the churchyard, in Christchurch churchyard, people would be paid to sit in here all night long to watch over the bodies to make sure that the body snatchers never had them. And the church itself, Christchurch, well, that's where I was married. Now I hope you've all enjoyed yourselves, everybody, and if you want to come on any of our walking tours, wait for that taxi to go past. If you want to come on any of our walking tours, please do. Free London Walking Tours, Andrew Gray is the guy who runs it, and well, most times you'll find me there as their guide. I want to wish you all a very good day, and come again.